Rather than art making being about representation, the question is going to be, what does art do? Can art be useless? Art can be useless, and sometimes that can be a good thing, but it can also perform all sorts of other roles. We're not asking questions like, is it art? Is it painting? Or is it sculpture? But rather we'll ask what a specific art object can do. But we'll also ask, what do we as art audiences do? How do we affect art? And how do we affect the way art works and what it does? Caspar David Friedrich looked upon the world as otherworldly, sublime, over there, and although he wanted audiences to share his own communion with nature, he appeared to set up a sort of distinct split between humankind and the natural world. Perhaps there's something inescapable about that split. But for now, we're going to try to think otherwise. We're going to try to think that there is, or there should be, a sort of solidarity or equality between humans and non-humans, and art will help us to think this way. John Mualem said maybe you have to believe in the value of everything to believe in the value of anything. There was an important moment, mostly centered around Western Europe. I think perhaps specifically it feels to me in the UK around the millennium, where relational aesthetics was everywhere. Relational aesthetics was a term that described art that generated relations between people. Artists generated social situations. In this case, though, we're interested in another step, relations between people and many other things and many other beings. Overlapping with relational aesthetics, there's another space of art making called participatory practice, in which artists encourage audiences to be collaborators, working together to establish meaning, stage experiences, make objects. We're going to be thinking a bit about how we might generate participatory experiences, but we might want to think of non-humans as participants too. If we think that rocks and cats and plants and oceans and all sorts of other things are just as important or more important than we humans are, we might be able to think of them and us differently. Communion. The word anthropocentric means that everything centers around humans. We're the center of everything. Anthropomorphism means making things the same as us. It is a sort of colonial behavior that doesn't want to understand behaviors, appearances, materials that aren't us, that are unfamiliar, and instead tries to make them familiar, make them more like us, again setting up a sort of split between an idea of them and an idea of us. John Berger, in his book Why Look at Animals, said, "To suppose that animals first entered the human imagination as meat or leather or horn is to project a 19th century attitude backwards across the millennia. Animals first entered the imagination as messengers and promises. For example, the domestication of cattle did not begin as a simple prospect of milk and meat. Cattle had magical functions, sometimes oracular, sometimes sacrificial, and the choice of a given species as magical, tameable, and alimentary was originally determined by the habits, proximity, and invitation of the animal in question. The word Anthropocene is defined as the current geological age, viewed as the period during which human activity has been the dominant influence on climate and the environment. It's an anthropocentric worldview that got us to this point of climate emergency that was being debated during the COP26 climate summit. Can we get beyond this human-centered perspective? Maybe. Can art help us do this? Maybe. We might have to suspend disbelief in order to get there, though. I know that a rock doesn't have a heart or a soul. It doesn't think, but it does tell us about the history of the world and about how the world was formed and where it comes from, and it's full of atoms that are constantly moving. Does that make it live? Anyway, if we were able to think of rocks and other inanimate things as being not necessarily alive but active, that might encourage much more sensitive and responsible ways of dealing with the world around us. We're going to be making work that calls people in, invites them to think, to act, to participate, to think about what they're doing with art or to art. The implication of that question might be that they and we think about what we're doing to the world around us. What is our effect on the world around us? What is our impact on artwork, and what is its impact on us? What do we do to each other? Julia Kristeva, in writing on the 45th Venice Biennale, said that much of the work she saw there seemed not to ask us to contemplate images, but to communicate with beings. Both contemplation and communication are active states, but perhaps they're quite different. One oriented inwards and the other oriented outwards. Objects are powerful, but are they powerful because we invest powers in them, project stories onto them, or because they themselves have a sort of internal, independent agency? Agency is one's independent capability, the ability to take action. A fetish object is an object believed to have supernatural powers, or in particular, a human-made object that has power over others. We're going to be making things, writing things, painting things, whilst asking how we connect to the world. And that means not just the world of humans, but the world of materials, organic life, other species, a universe of forces acting upon each other. Art opens us up to the non-human world that we're all part of. Does art have an effect? What effects does it have? Is art something that is waiting to be activated by art audiences? How about if we imagine that art objects are already active without us humans, and that they don't need other people in order to function or be fully realized? Or we might think that both art objects and human spectators are both activated at the point of meeting. An effect is when something happens. It's an event, or you could say it's a happening. A recent branch of thinking called object-oriented philosophy seems to say that objects have their own histories, stories, agency, and don't need us in order to be active, because they're active all by themselves, leaving human audiences irrelevant or redundant, or at least not quite so special anymore. And that's an important shift for the human ego, a shift that encourages the beginning of a different relationship with the world. What is an object? A material thing that can be seen and touched, a thing to which a specified action or feeling is directed. And what is a subject? A person. And what is subjectivity? The quality of being that is influenced by feeling, opinions, and so on. So objects are typically acted upon by subjects. Objects wait for things to happen to them, we're going to play with the idea of switching these definitions around and confusing them a little. What happens when art acts? Speaking. Do objects speak? We often say about all sorts of animate and inanimate things, when we're moved or affected by them, that speaks to me. Do we speak to objects? We speak with our mouths, lips, tongue, but we also talk about body language. We speak with our eyes and with other body and brain parts in all sorts of other ways. John Berger, again, in his book Why Look at Animals, says, "With their parallel lives, animals offer man a companionship which is different from any offered by human exchange. Different because it is a companionship offered to the loneliness of man as a species. Such an unspeaking companionship was felt to be so equal that often one finds the conviction that it was man who lacked the capacity to speak with animals." Hence the stories and legends of exceptional beings like Orpheus, who could talk with animals in their own language. What happens when an artwork addresses you in a very direct way, or asks you questions? Objects might say, "Hey, you there, what are you doing looking at me?" Or, "I'm nothing without you," or, "I need you," "I don't need you, you do something to me." Sometimes, if an artwork seems indifferent to you, it doesn't care about you, if it doesn't seem to need you at all, you might be perversely attracted. In art school, people often seem to ask each other about the artist's intention for a work. What if we think that intention comes not from the artist but from the work itself, from the thing or the object or the surface, the painting, the drawing, whatever it is? It's the artwork that intends something, not the author. Then it's not so much about what the artist wants or what the spectator wants, but rather what the artwork wants. Or it's all three at once. We're going to be making things that consider those different sorts of wants. What do artworks want? What do objects want? What do rocks want? Trees, plants, other species? And what do we want from them? What sort of relationships do we want with the things, objects, materials around us? Maybe it's better to ask how we can change our relationship with the physical world so that we can take more care of natural resources, so that we can think about what we save and what we disregard, and so that we can tune in to new experiences. After all, art is always about changing perspectives.